The great hall of the Galactic Concord stretched for miles in every direction. Its walls were made of living crystal that pulsed with soft blue light. 12 platforms floated in a circle around a central stage, each one holding the representatives of the galaxy's oldest and most powerful species. They had ruled the Milky Way for 50,000 years. They had seen empires rise and fall. They had crushed rebellions and stopped wars. And today, they had gathered to judge humanity. Commander Lisa Monroe stood on the central stage, with her hands clasped behind her back. Her uniform was wrinkled from weeks of travel, and dark circles hung beneath her eyes. She had not slept properly since the trial began. Beside her stood Ambassador Kevin Hartley, a tall man with gray hair and tired eyes. He had spent his entire career building bridges between humans and aliens. Now he watched those bridges burn. "The accused species will hear the charges," announced High Arbiter Veltarak. He was a shimmering one, a being made entirely of living crystal. Light passed through his body and split into rainbows that danced across the floor. His voice echoed through the hall like wind chimes in a storm. Kevin stepped forward. "With respect, High Arbiter, we have heard these charges many times. We have answered them many times. What more can we say?" "You can say nothing," hissed Counselor Myrthine from her platform. She was an endless tide, a serpentine creature with scales that shifted colors as she moved. Her species had controlled galactic trade routes for 10,000 years. "Your guilt is clear. Your sentence is decided. This hearing is merely a formality." Lisa felt anger rise in her chest, but she pushed it down. She was a soldier. She knew how to control her emotions. "Then why hold it at all?" she asked calmly. "If our fate is already sealed, why make us stand here and listen to your accusations?" "Because the galaxy must see," said Ambassador Zethral of the Stone Singers. He was a massive creature, 12 feet tall, with skin like polished granite. Unlike the others, his voice held something that might have been regret. "They must understand why we do what we do." The charges were read aloud by a machine voice that echoed through the chamber. Humanity had expanded too quickly. In less than 200 years, they had spread across 17 star systems. They had built colonies on worlds the Concord had marked as protected. They had developed weapons that made the elder species nervous. They had shared their culture with younger races, inspiring them to question traditions that had lasted for millennia. "Your music plays in cantinas on 100 worlds," Myrthine accused. "Your stories fill the databases of species who should be preserving their own heritage. Your ideas spread like a disease." "We shared our culture freely," Kevin replied. "Others chose to embrace it. Is that a crime?" "It is when it destabilizes the natural order," Veltarak said. "The galaxy has been at peace for 10,000 years. Your presence threatens that peace." "How?" Lisa demanded. "We have started no wars. We have attacked no one. We simply exist. And in existing, you inspire others to change." The High Arbiter's crystal form pulsed with cold light. "Change leads to conflict. Conflict leads to destruction. We have seen it countless times throughout galactic history," Lisa wanted to argue. She wanted to point out that stagnation was its own kind of death. She wanted to tell them that humanity's greatest strength was its ability to adapt, to grow, to become something better. But she could see in their alien eyes that no argument would change their minds. They had already decided. The vote was called. Each of the 12 species cast their decision into the central machine. Lisa watched the results appear on a holographic display. One by one, guilty, guilty, guilty. 12 times the word appeared, each one like a nail in a coffin. "The sentence is exile," Veltarak announced. "The human species will be removed from galactic space. They will be transported beyond the outer rim into the void between galaxies. A barrier will be constructed to ensure they cannot return." Kevin's face went pale. "You're sending us to die. Nothing can survive in the intergalactic void." "That is not our concern," Myrthine said with a cold smile. "You wish to explore. You wish to expand? Now, you will have all the space you could ever want. The evacuation began 3 days later. Humans across 17 star systems were rounded up and loaded onto transport ships. Families were separated and then reunited in crowded cargo bays. Children cried for toys left behind. Old people whispered prayers to gods who seemed to have abandoned them. Lisa supervised the evacuation of Earth itself. She stood on a platform in Geneva and watched millions of people file into massive arc ships that blocked out the sun. Danny Castillo, a young pilot barely 20 years old, stood beside her with a datapad in his hands. 12 billion people, Danny said quietly. We're loading 12 billion people onto ships that were built in 6 months. Half of them probably won't even make it past the rim. They'll make it, Lisa said firmly. We'll make sure of it. How can you be so confident? Lisa turned to look at him. Her eyes were hard, but there was something else in them too. Something that looked almost like hope, because giving up isn't in our nature. They think they're sending us to die, but they don't understand what we are. We're survivors. Danny, it's what we do. The last ship to leave Earth was called Wanderer's Hope. Lisa stood at its viewport and watched her homeworld shrink until it was just a blue dot among countless stars. Around her, other refugees pressed against the glass, tears streaming down their faces. Some whispered goodbye. Others stood in shocked silence. Course is set, Danny reported from the pilot's seat. Fleet is assembled and ready. We're just waiting on your order, Commander. Lisa took a deep breath. Behind her, Earth disappeared entirely, swallowed by the vastness of space. Ahead lay only darkness, the empty void that the Concorde believed would be humanity's grave. Take us out, she said. The fleet moved as one. 12,000 ships carrying the last survivors of human civilization. They passed through systems that had once welcomed them and found only cold silence. Orbital stations that had traded with humans now refused to respond to their signals. Alien ships turned away rather than acknowledge their existence. At the edge of the outer rim, they found the barrier waiting for them. It was a wall of shimmering energy that stretched across 300 light-years, completely encircling the path to galactic civilization. Concorde warships patrolled its length, their weapons trained on the human fleet. Last chance to turn back, Danny said quietly, though they both knew there was nowhere to turn back to. Lisa shook her head. No, this is where our real journey begins. The fleet crossed the barrier and plunged into the darkness beyond. One by one, stars of the Milky Way faded behind them until only the faint glow of distant galaxies lit their way. The exile had begun. The first decade in the void was a nightmare that never seemed to end. Ships broke down without warning. Life support systems failed in the middle of sleep cycles. Entire arc ships went dark, their populations lost to the cold emptiness of space. Food ran short. Medicine ran shorter. Hope seemed to vanish entirely. Lisa Monroe, now Admiral Monroe, aged 20 years in those first 10. Her hair turned gray. Her face grew lined with worry and exhaustion, but she refused to stop. Every morning she woke up and faced the impossible task of keeping 12 billion people alive in a place where nothing should survive. We lost contact with the Pilgrim's Rest, Danny Castillo reported one morning. He was no longer the nervous young pilot she had met during the evacuation. Years of hardship had forged him into something harder, something stronger. That's the 4th arc ship this month. How many people? 200,000. Lisa closed her eyes for a moment. 200,000 lives gone in an instant, added to the millions they had already lost. Sometimes she wondered if the Concorde had been right. Maybe humanity was meant to die out here in the dark. But then she would look at the survivors. She would see children playing in the corridors of cramped ships. She would see engineers working 18-hour days to keep failing systems running. She would see doctors performing surgeries with improvised tools and expired medicine. And she would remember why she kept fighting. 50 years after the exile began, everything changed. Dr. Patricia Vance was a physicist who had spent her career studying theoretical energy fields. When the evacuation happened, she had grabbed her research notes and nothing else. For 5 decades, She had worked in a tiny laboratory aboard the Ark ship New Horizon, trying to understand the strange readings their sensors kept detecting in the void. Carlos, come look at this, she called her assistant one morning. Carlos Mendez was a mechanical engineer who had somehow become Patricia's closest friend and collaborator. He walked over to her console and squinted at the data streaming across the screen. What am I looking at? Dark matter, Patricia said, her voice trembling with excitement. Concentrated dark matter, flowing through the void like rivers. Invisible rivers of pure energy, and we're floating right in the middle of them. Carlos scratched his head. I thought dark matter was just theoretical. How can there be rivers of it? It's not theoretical anymore. Patricia pulled up a three-dimensional map that showed currents of energy swirling through the darkness around them. The Concorde never explored the galactic void. They assumed it was empty, but it's not empty at all. It's full of energy that nobody knew existed. The discovery spread through the fleet like wildfire. Engineers who had been struggling to keep ancient reactors running suddenly had access to unlimited power. Scientists who had given up hope suddenly had a new frontier to explore. For the first time since the exile began, people started to believe they might actually survive. Lisa called an emergency meeting of the fleet's leadership aboard her flagship. 100 captains, admirals, and civilian leaders crowded into a conference room that had never been designed for so many people. Dr. Vance has given us a gift, Lisa announced. A chance to do more than just survive. We can build something new out here. Something the Concorde never imagined possible. With respect, Admiral, said Captain Ruth Delgado of the Ark ship Phoenix. We don't have the resources for major construction projects. We're barely keeping our ships flying as it is. That changes now. Lisa activated a holographic display showing the dark matter streams Patricia had discovered. These rivers flow past dozens of rogue planets, worlds that drifted out of the galaxy billions of years ago. They're cold and dark, but they have minerals, metals, everything we need to build. And with dark matter as our power source, we can make those worlds habitable. The project took another 50 years, but humanity threw itself into the work with desperate energy. They landed on frozen worlds and burrowed deep into their crusts. They built underground cities lit by artificial suns. They developed new technologies that harnessed the dark matter streams. Technologies that the Concorde had never dreamed possible. Gregory Dunn was born on one of those new colony worlds. 52 years after the exile began, his grandmother was Lisa Monroe, though she had died before he was old enough to remember her. He grew up on stories of Earth, of blue skies and green forests, of oceans that stretched to the horizon. He never saw any of those things himself, but he carried them in his heart like precious memories. By the time Gregory became an admiral, the exiled Terran Confederacy controlled 47 worlds in the void. Their ships no longer limped between stars on failing engines. They surfed the dark matter streams, crossing distances and days that would have taken the Concorde years. Their weapons no longer relied on primitive missiles and lasers. They had learned to bend gravity itself to create miniature black holes that could crush anything in their path. We should go back, said Lieutenant Maria Espinosa one evening. She and Gregory stood on an observation deck watching the distant glow of the Milky Way. Show them what we've become. Gregory shook his head slowly. Not yet. The time isn't right. It's been over a century. They probably think we're dead. Good. Let them think that. Gregory's eyes were fixed on that distant glow, and there was something cold in them. Something patient. My grandmother used to tell me that revenge is a dish best served cold. But she also taught me that the best revenge is living well. We've done that. We've survived. We've thrived. But the Concorde still sits in their comfortable halls, congratulating themselves on getting rid of the human problem. So what do? We wait. Gregory turned away from the viewport. We watch. We grow stronger. And when the time comes, when they need us most, we'll return. Not as refugees begging for mercy. Not as exiles crawling back home. We'll return as something they never expected us to become. What's that? Gregory smiled, and there was no warmth in it. Their only hope. The Confederacy continued to grow in silence. They built shipyards that could produce warships in weeks, instead of years. They trained soldiers in combat techniques the Concorde had never seen. They developed surveillance technology that let them watch the galaxy from across the void, tracking every ship, every fleet, every political development. And they waited, patient as stones, cold as the space around them. One day, Gregory knew, the Concorde would face a threat they couldn't handle. One day, they would remember the species they had cast out. One day, they would realize their mistake. On that day, humanity would answer. But the answer would come with a price. The Vethkai came without warning. They emerged from the space beyond the galactic rim, from a direction that no sensor network covered, from a darkness that even the Concorde had never thought to watch. They were not a species in any normal sense of the word. They were hunger given form, a swarm of billions of organic ships that consumed everything in their path. The first world to fall was a small colony on the edge of Concorde space. Its distress signal lasted exactly 47 seconds before cutting off. When a patrol fleet arrived to investigate, they found nothing but bare rock where a thriving city had once stood. The Vethkai had stripped the planet of everything, including its atmosphere. Within a week, 3 more worlds had fallen. Within a month, the number was 20-6. Admiral Cathros, of the Shimmering Ones, led the first major counterattack. His fleet of 2,000 crystalline warships was the pride of his species. Vessels that had defended galactic peace for 10 millennia. They met the Vethkai swarm above a colony world called Bright Hope, and the battle lasted less than an hour. Kethros watched in horror as the swarm ships absorbed every weapon his fleet threw at them. Plasma bolts splashed harmlessly against organic hulls. Missiles were caught and devoured before they could detonate. When the crystalline ships tried to retreat, the swarm surrounded them and tore them apart piece by piece. "Fall back," Kethros ordered, his voice cracking with fear. "All ships, fall back to the core worlds." Only 12 ships escaped. The rest, nearly 2,000 vessels carrying over 1 million crew members, were consumed by the swarm. Their crystalline bodies were broken down into raw materials, their technology absorbed. Their crews reduced to biomass that fed the ever-growing horde. "Hi, Arbiter." Veltarak received the news in the same great hall where he had once sentenced humanity to exile. He stood on his platform and watched holographic images of world after world going dark. Their populations devoured, their resources stripped away. "How is this possible?" he demanded. "We are the Galactic Concorde. We have maintained peace for 10,000 years. How can this happen?" Counselor Murthan slithered onto her platform, her scales dull with stress and fear. Her homeworld, the great ocean planet of Siltheris, had fallen 3 days ago. 3 billion of her people had been consumed in a single afternoon. She was now one of the last survivors of her species. "Our weapons do nothing," she said, her voice hollow. "They adapt to everything we throw at them. We destroyed one of their ships, and within hours the rest of the swarm had evolved defenses against the weapon we used. They learn. They grow. They cannot be stopped." "There must be something we can do," said Ambassador Zethral. The stone singer looked older than he had 3 centuries ago, his granite skin cracked and worn. "Some weapon we haven't tried. Some alliance we haven't formed. We have tried everything," Veltarak said. "We have united every species in the Concorde. We have deployed every weapon in our arsenal. We have evacuated billions of civilians to the core worlds, and still they come." The great hall fell silent. On the holographic display, another world blinked out of existence. Somewhere in the galaxy, another billion lives had ended. "There is one option," Zethral said quietly. "One species we haven't asked for help," Orthene hissed with anger. "Do not speak of them. They are dead. We made certain of it, did we?" The Zethral turned to face her, and there was something in his stone eyes that might have been shame. "We assumed they would die in the void. We hoped they would die. But we never actually confirmed it. We built the barrier, and we never looked back." "Because there was nothing to see," Veltarak said firmly. "The intergalactic void is empty. No species could survive there, and yet we never checked." Zethral activated his own console and brought up sensor data from the barrier. "I have been studying the readings for weeks. There are energy signatures beyond the barrier. Faint ones, but consistent. Someone is out there. The argument lasted for hours. Some counselors refused to even consider the possibility. Others pointed out that even if humans had survived, they had no reason to help the species that had exiled them. A few suggested sending a probe just to see what was there in the end. Desperation won out over pride. The probe was small, barely larger than a shuttle. It crossed the barrier at a point where no patrol ships remained, most of them having been destroyed fighting the swarm. It transmitted data back for 6 hours, traveling deeper into the void than any Concorde vessel had ever gone. Then it found something. Veltarak watched the images appear on his display with growing disbelief. Stations the size of moons orbited rogue planets. Shipyards stretched across the darkness, building vessels unlike anything the Concorde had ever seen. A fleet of thousands of warships patrolled the void in perfect formation. Impossible, Marathine whispered. This is impossible. A face appeared on the probe's communication screen. A human face, belonging to a woman in a crisp military uniform. Her eyes were cold, her expression unreadable. I am Admiral Sandra Vance of the exiled Terran Confederacy, she said. You have entered our territory without permission. State your purpose. Veltarak's crystal form flickered with emotions he could barely name. Fear, shame, hope. Vance, we require assistance. Our galaxy faces a threat we cannot defeat alone. Sandra's expression didn't change. Is that so? The Vethkai swarm has destroyed over 100 worlds. Billions have died. Our fleets are shattered. We have nowhere else to turn. There was a long pause. Sandra seemed to be listening to something off-screen, conferring with others who weren't visible. When she looked back at the probe, her eyes were even colder than before. 300 years ago, you sent us into the dark to die. You called us dangerous. You called us unpredictable. You said we didn't deserve a place among the stars. She leaned forward slightly. Now you come begging for our help. Tell me, High Arbiter, why should we save the species that tried to kill us? Veltarak had no answer. For the first time in his 10,000-year life, he had absolutely no idea what to say. We will discuss your request, Sandra said finally. Do not contact us again. When we have reached a decision, we will contact you. The screen went dark. In the great hall of the Galactic Concorde, the most powerful beings in the galaxy sat in stunned silence. Their fate was no longer in their own hands. It rested with the species they had wronged. The exiles they had left for dead. All they could do was wait, and pray that humanity was more merciful than they had been. The Confederate Council met in the Great Chamber at the heart of Perseverance. The world humanity had built from nothing in the void. The room was circular, with seats rising in tiers around a central platform. Every seat was filled. Admirals, governors, scientists, and civilian leaders had gathered to decide the fate of the galaxy that had once cast them out. Ambassador. Nicholas Grant stood at the central platform, his hands clasped behind his back. He was a tall man with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much. His grandmother had been one of the original exiles, a woman who had died still dreaming of blue skies she would never see again. Nicholas carried her memories like a burden, along with the memories of everyone else humanity had lost in those dark early years. The situation is simple, he said to the assembled council. The Concorde is dying. The Vethkai swarm has consumed over 200 worlds. Their fleets are broken. Their populations are being devoured by the millions. Within a year, perhaps 2, the swarm will reach the core worlds. When that happens, every species in the galaxy will be extinct. Good, said Admiral Victor Reyes, commander of the Confederate Third Fleet. He was a hard man with scars on his face and hatred in his heart. Let them die. They tried to kill us. They deserve everything that's happening to them. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber. Nicholas understood the feeling. He felt it himself sometimes, late at night when he thought about the billions of humans who had died in the void. The children who had starved, the elderly who had frozen, the families who had watched their ships break apart around them, all because the Concorde had been afraid of what humanity might become. I understand your anger, Nicholas said calmly. I share it. But I ask you to consider something else. If we let the galaxy die, we become exactly what they said we were. Monsters. Dangers to civilized life. We prove them right about us. We don't owe them anything, said Governor Patricia Orozco of the Colony World Haven. We build everything we have with our own hands. We survived without their help. Why should we risk our people to save theirs? Because that's who we are. Lieutenant Commander Hannah Grant stepped forward to stand beside her father. She was young, barely 30, but she had inherited her family's gift for speaking. My great-great-grandmother was Lisa Monroe. She led our people into exile. She watched millions die. And do you know what she said before she passed? She said that humanity's greatest strength isn't our technology or our weapons. It's our ability to rise above our worst instincts. To be better than we have to be. The chamber fell silent. The Concord judged us based on fear, Hannah continued. They looked at what we might become and decided we were too dangerous to exist. They never gave us a chance to show them who we really are. Now we have that chance. We can prove that we're not the monsters they feared. We can show the entire galaxy what humanity truly represents. The debate continued for hours. Some council members argued that humanity owed nothing to the species that had tried to destroy them. Others pointed out that the Vethkai would eventually turn their attention to the void, and that it was better to fight them in galactic space than on humanity's doorstep. A few, like Hannah, believed that saving the galaxy was simply the right thing to do. In the end, the council voted to send a delegation. Nicholas led the diplomatic team himself. His shuttle crossed the barrier accompanied by a single escort ship. A gesture of good faith that left him vulnerable but showed the Concord that humanity was willing to talk. When he arrived at Nexus Prime, the last major Concord stronghold, he found a galaxy in ruins. Refugee ships crowded the space around the planet. Millions of aliens fleeing worlds that no longer existed. The once proud stations of the Concord were now overcrowded shelters, filled with the wounded and the dying. The Great Hall, where humanity had been sentenced to exile, now served as a medical center, its crystal walls stained with alien blood. Velturok met Nicholas at the entrance to what remained of the council chamber. The High Arbiter looked broken. His crystal form was cracked in a dozen places, and his light pulsed weakly like a dying flame. Behind him stood the remnants of the Concord leadership. Marthane, last survivor of the Endless Tide. Zethrel, whose people had been reduced to a few thousand refugees. Representatives of species that had once numbered in the billions, now facing extinction. Ambassador Grant Velturok said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Thank you for coming." "Don't thank me yet," Nicholas replied. "We haven't agreed to anything." They gathered in a small room that had once been a storage closet. There wasn't enough space anywhere else. Nicholas sat across from the Concord leaders, Hannah at his side, and studied the faces of the beings who had once held the power of life and death over his entire species. 300 years ago, you stood in judgment over us, Nicholas began. You called us dangerous. You said we spread too fast, adapted too well, inspired too much change. You sentenced 12 billion people to death because you were afraid of what we might become. We were wrong, Velturok said. The words seemed to cause him physical pain. We see that now, do you? Or do you just need our help? Both. The High Arbiter's honesty was surprising. We were wrong to fear you, and we were wrong to exile you. But even if the swarm had never come, I believe I would have eventually reached the same conclusion. Watching you survive, watching you build an empire in the void where nothing should live, you proved us wrong in ways we never imagined possible. Nicholas studied the alien's cracked crystal face, searching for deception. He found only exhaustion and regret. What do you want from us? Mirathene asked bitterly. Name your price. We have nothing left to bargain with, so whatever you demand we will have to accept. I don't want revenge, Nicholas said quietly. Revenge won't bring back the billions we lost in the void. It won't undo the suffering your judgment caused. He leaned forward. What I want is justice. I want acknowledgement. I want the galaxy to know what you did to us, and I want them to know that despite everything, we chose to be better than you were. He listed humanity's terms. The barrier would come down permanently. All former human territories would be returned. Humanity would receive permanent representation in whatever government replaced the Concord. And the Concord would publicly admit to every species in the galaxy that their treatment of humanity had been wrong. In exchange, Nicholas concluded, we will deploy our fleets against the Vethkai. We will share our technology with your surviving forces. We will do everything in our power to stop the swarm and save as many lives as possible. Those terms are generous, Zethral said slowly. More generous than we deserve, as Hannah agreed. They are. My father argued for harsher demands. There are many in the Confederacy who wanted us to demand your complete surrender or to simply let you die. We chose mercy instead. Not because you earned it, but because mercy is who we choose to be. The vote was held immediately. There was no debate. The Concord had no leverage, no alternatives, no hope, except what humanity offered. 12 species, the shattered remnants of galactic civilization, agreed unanimously to humanity's terms as Nicholas prepared to leave. Velterac stopped him with a gentle touch on his arm. Ambassador Grant, for what it's worth, I am sorry. Not because we are desperate. Not because we need your help. But because what we did to your people was genuinely wrong, and I should have spoken against it 300 years ago. Nicholas looked into the alien's fading crystalline eyes and saw something he had never expected to find. Sincerity. Algae accepted, he said quietly. Now let's go save your galaxy. The Confederate First Fleet emerged from dark space like ghosts rising from the shadows. 3,000 warships dropped into normal space above the besieged world of Kethler, where 2 billion refugees huddled in underground bunkers, while the Vethkai swarm devoured everything above them. The planet's surface was already half consumed, its oceans drained, its cities reduced to biological waste. Admiral Sandra Vance stood on the bridge of her flagship, the Perseverance, and watched the swarm ships cluster around the dying world. There were millions of them, organic vessels ranging in size from small fighters to massive hive ships the size of moons. They moved with a terrible coordination, billions of individual creatures acting as one hungry mind. All vessels. Report status, Sandra ordered. 1st Division ready. 2nd Division ready. 3rd Division standing by. Sandra nodded. Her crews had trained for this moment for generations. They had studied the swarm through long-range sensors, analyzed their tactics, identified their weaknesses. Now it was time to see if their preparations would be enough. Engage gravity lances. The Confederate ships opened fire with weapons the galaxy had never seen. Concentrated beams of gravitational force struck the swarm ships, creating microscopic singularities inside their organic hulls. The Vethkai had evolved to resist plasma and kinetics energy weapons and missiles. They had no defense against having their own mass turned against them. Swarm ships crumpled like paper balls, crushed into dense spheres of matter by their own weight. Hive ships that had shrugged off entire Concord fleets broke apart under the impossible pressure. For the first time since the invasion began, the Vethkai were dying faster than they could reproduce. The battle lasted 6 hours. When it ended, not a single swarm ship remained in the system. On the surface of Kethler, refugees emerged from their bunkers to see human dropships descending through the smoke. Marine Captain Derek Orozco led the first squad to touch down, his boots crunching on ground that was half organic waste and half bare rock. Around him, his soldiers fanned out to secure a perimeter. A group of aliens approached them cautiously. They were stone singers, massive granite-skinned beings who had been trapped on this world when the invasion cut off evacuation routes. The largest of them, a female with cracks running through her stone face, stepped forward and stared at Derek with enormous eyes. "You are human," she said, her voice rumbling like distant thunder. "We thought humans were extinct." "Not quite," Derek replied. He holstered his weapon and extended his hand, palm up, in a gesture of peace. "We're here to help. Is anyone injured? Do you have food and water?" The stone singer stared at his offered hand for a long moment. Then slowly she reached out and touched it with fingers like carved marble. "We have nothing," she admitted. "The swarm took everything. We survived only because they hadn't finished processing this continent yet. Then we'll get you what you need. Derek activated his communicator. This is Orozco, to Perseverance. We have survivors on the surface. Request immediate humanitarian supplies. Medical teams, food, water, shelter materials. Confirmed, Captain. Supplies are being loaded now. The Stone Singer watched him with something like wonder in her ancient eyes. Why are you helping us? Your species was exiled by ours. Cast into darkness. Left to die. Derek thought about the question for a moment. He thought about his grandmother, Patricia Orozco, who had grown up on stories of the exile. He thought about the billions of humans who had died in the void. He thought about everything his people had suffered, because the galaxy had feared them. Oh, because someone has to, he said finally. And we're the only ones who can. Across the galaxy, the pattern repeated. Confederate fleets appeared in system after system, driving back the swarm, evacuating survivors, establishing defensive perimeters. Human doctors treated wounds inflicted by biological weapons. Human engineers rebuilt shattered infrastructure. Human soldiers stood guard over refugee camps, protecting aliens who had once celebrated humanity's exile. The war lasted 18 months. The Vethkai were numerous, but they were not infinitely adaptable. Confederate scientists found weaknesses in their biology. Frequencies that disrupted their hive mind coordination, chemical compounds that broke down their organic hulls. Slowly, system by system, the swarm was pushed back. The final battle took place above the Vethkai homeworld, a nightmare planet of pulsing organic towers and writhing biomass. The swarm had retreated there in desperation, gathering every remaining ship for a final stand. Sandra Vance led the assault personally, commanding a combined fleet of Confederate warships and what remained of the Concorde's naval forces. This is it, Sandra announced over the fleet-wide channel. Everything we've built, everything we've sacrificed, it all comes down to this moment. 300 years ago, the galaxy sent us into darkness. Today, we bring light to the last shadow that threatens galactic civilization. The battle was brutal. Swarm ships threw themselves at the Confederate lines in suicidal waves. Hive minds coordinated attacks that should have been impossible to predict. Ships on both sides were destroyed by the hundreds, their crews consumed by the vacuum of space. But in the end, humanity's technology proved superior. The gravity lances tore through the swarm's defenses. Confederate Marines landed on the surface and fought their way to the central hive. When the last hive mind fell silent, the remaining swarm ships scattered, their coordination broken, their purpose lost. Sandra stood on the bridge of the Perseverance and looked out at the organic wreckage floating in space around her. Somewhere behind her, a communications officer was crying with relief. Somewhere else, crew members were embracing each other. The war was over. The galaxy was saved. She activated the fleet-wide broadcast, knowing that her words would be transmitted to every corner of civilized space. 3 centuries ago, you told us we didn't belong among the stars. You cast us into the dark and expected us to die. Instead, we became something new, something stronger. And when darkness came for you, we chose to light the way. She paused, thinking of Lisa Monroe, who had led her people into exile, of Patricia Vance, who had discovered the dark matter streams, of all the millions who had died so that humanity could survive and grow. We are humanity. We do not forget. But we also do not abandon those in need, even those who abandoned us. Today marks a new era, not just for humans, but for all species willing to embrace change, growth, and cooperation. On Nexus Prime, Veltarok watched the broadcast in the rebuilt council chamber. Tears of liquid light streamed down his cracked, crystalline face. Beside him, the surviving members of the Concorde sat in stunned silence, still struggling to process everything that had happened. "You're fools," the High Arbiter whispered. Ambassador Nicholas Grant, who had remained on Nexus Prime throughout the war, stood nearby with Hannah at his side. He looked at the broken alien who had once held such power and felt something he hadn't expected to feel: compassion. "Yes," Nicholas said gently. "You were. But you're alive to learn from it. That's more than many get." The reconstruction began in earnest. Human engineers worked alongside alien scientists to rebuild destroyed worlds. Human teachers shared the knowledge of dark matter technology with species that had never imagined such things were possible. Human diplomats helped negotiate new treaties, new alliances, new ways of cooperating that didn't rely on fear and control. The Galactic Concord was dissolved by unanimous vote. In its place rose the Stellar Congress, a new governing body where every species had equal representation. Humans held permanent seats, but they didn't seek to dominate. They had learned in their long exile that true strength came not from power over others, but from the power to choose compassion over cruelty. 5 years after the war ended, Sandra Vance gave her final address as Admiral of the Confederate Fleet. She stood on a stage on New Earth, a world that had been terraformed to match humanity's original home. Blue skies stretched overhead. Green grass covered rolling hills. An ocean sparkled on the horizon. "My great-grandmother never saw a blue sky," Sandra said to the crowd. "She was born in the void, lived her entire life in darkness, and died dreaming of sunlight she would never feel. But she never lost hope. She never stopped believing that one day her descendants would stand under open skies again." She looked up at the clouds drifting overhead, white against endless blue. "We earned this, not through conquest, not through revenge. We earned it by being true to who we are, by choosing mercy when we could have chosen hatred, by offering help when we could have offered nothing." She smiled, and for the first time in years, it was a smile without shadows. "The galaxy cast us out because they feared what we might become. Now they know. We became exactly what we always were: human." In the crowd, Nicholas Grant held his daughter's hand and watched the sky. Somewhere up there, beyond the blue, the stars were waiting. Stars that now welcomed humanity as friends, as partners, as saviors. The exile was over. The return was complete, and humanity's greatest journey was just beginning.